Good evening once again, and welcome to tonight's. How do you call this? Is this an episode of the Crash Course series? So,
Sort
tonight's
of, or
episode will be about Literature 101 or the basics of literature. Why we read, or why is literature impressive? Why we should start reading if we never read, and how do we appreciate or understand literature better? Okay, so this will be tonight's agenda. We are hoping to cover all of these topics. The first one is the introduction to literature as a discipline. So that's just a very short background of the definition of literature. Next, the purpose of literature. How is literature helpful to us as an individual and in our daily lives? Next, the stages of literary appreciation. Are you all, is any of you familiar that this topic exists? There are stages of literary appreciation. Next, the last one, which is my favorite topic, the approaches to literary criticism. Okay, so before we proceed, just a little background about myself. My name is Vanessa de Gracia. I am 22 years old, and aside from my personal interests and hobbies, I am a senior high school teacher at the University of San Carlos. I belong to the Communication, Languages, and the Arts department. So I teach the following subjects. First is oral communication. Next, reading and writing skills. I also teach, of course, 21st century literature and contemporary arts. So I hope that I am credible enough for you to listen to my talk tonight. So I just want everyone to enjoy our talk. Let's just consider this a casual talk, just getting to know literature more, or just, how do you call it? Just inspiring ourselves to give literature a chance. Okay, so you can always turn on your audios if you want to participate in even in the middle of my talks. You can also chat if you feel awkward talking to the mic or showing your camera. So let's start. Okay, so let's go to the definition of literature. They say that, according to a few sources of mine, literature, there is literature with a small letter L and literature with a capital letter L. So I apologize for not being able to give you the full experience of my presentation. I am supposed to have a few animations for this presentation, but there was a little problem, so I just opted to use the PDF format. Okay, so literature with a small letter L, or literature in general, is defined as any type of written works, so a body of written works, so anything that is written, published, or anything that can be read. So we can classify poetry, novels, essays, stories, and plays as a type of literature. If you also ask, we can also consider our tweets, our mere Facebook status or Facebook posts, our text messages, our letters to our loved ones. We can also call that literature. So literature can be classified into two, fiction and nonfiction. I guess we are already oriented on what fiction or nonfiction is. But just a recap, fiction are those literary works that are not based on real life events. They could happen in real life, but they did not happen in real life yet. And nonfiction are those that have already have factual basis. So essays and what else? Narratives, articles are called nonfiction. Okay. Also, another classification of literature is poetry or prose. So anything that is not a poem is called prose. What is the main difference between poetry and prose is that poetry is composed of lines and stanzas. Usually the words used in poetry are those that are very expressive, very decorative, or words that could have more meanings than what you can already see or you can already understand. So other than that, prose is something that follows a normal flow of conversation. So just written as it is. Okay, let's go to the other literature, the more curated literature, the one with a capital L. It is said that these types of literary texts are valued as works of art. Some of us say that anything can be considered art. Well, that is also true because art is very subjective, but these types of literature are those that have lasting value. So those that are really acclaimed universally or globally. These types of literature are very inventive, expressive, and original, of course. They contain ideas of permanent and universal interests. Therefore, these types of literature can be classified as the classics. Examples for this type of literature are the classics. So, okay, are you familiar with the following texts? The first one is Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen is a very well-known author for her novels. One of them is Pride and Prejudice. It also has a film. Other works of hers are Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, and Emma. Next, we have Sir William Shakespeare. He is very, very well known for his plays and his poetry as well. One very common, or let's say mainstream work of William Shakespeare is Romeo and Juliet. It is being talked about in classrooms all over the world, and for how many years already. He also wrote the play Hamlet, Macbeth, and The Tempest. Also, A Midsummer Night's Dream. That's a very good poem of his. Next, we have the father of short stories, Edgar Allan Poe. So I hope that you have all read at least one work of his. Edgar Allan Poe is considered the father of short stories for a very good reason. If you have read a lot of his works, you can notice a recurring theme. It's a very dark, or how do you call that, strange theme of his that he has written very incredibly. One very famous poetry of Edgar Allan Poe is Annabel Lee. So you say that you have memorized Annabel Lee, but did you, or were you able to really understand what Annabel Lee was about? So I hope that you all take time to reread that poem and understand it better. Some of his short stories, The Telltale Heart, is also a very creepy one. The Cask of Amontillado is my personal favorite. If you haven't read it, it's really, really worth it. Okay, so before we discuss more about his works, let us proceed to the next part of our talk. Okay. So I know that I haven't yet convinced everyone to start reading or really delve into literature. So let's discuss this topic. Why do we read? What is literature good for? Or why should we take time to read novels and poems when out there big things or bigger things are going on? So here are a few good reasons that I can give you to perhaps convince you to start reading or to read more. The first one is that literature saves us time. It might sound very ironic to us because reading a book, some of us consider reading a book as a waste of time. Why do we read books? We can watch films. We can watch instead of just read. So The first reason is it gives us an access to a range of emotions and events. These emotions and events would take us a lot of years, even decades and centuries and millennia to experience, diba? Especially in history. When we read about history, we are overwhelmed with a lot of facts or a lot of happenings from the past, all in one read. So that is how literature saves us time. In reality, literature is the greatest time saver. It lets you speed up time. For example, when we read about someone, we are taken into his life from his childhood to old age, from his childhood years to old age. That's how literature saves you time. It gives you the keys to a palace of knowledge. It lets you assess your life or assess the life of others in relation to your own experiences. Um, Lastly, it introduces you to fascinating people. Do we all agree on this? Sometimes these fascinating people only exist in books. That's why we should take time to read. For example, a Roman general, um, an 11th century French princess. We haven't met those people in person. So really delving into literature gives us the privilege or the prestige to experience these things. Okay? The next one, the next reason is that it is the greatest reality simulator. It's like a machine that puts us through infinite situations. It thoroughly takes you into other people's lives and makes you feel what it's like to be perhaps to be divorced, to lose a loved one, to be angry, to cry, or make a terrible mistake, even if we haven't experienced those firsthand. It cures us from provincialism and makes us citizens of the world. That is very true because as individuals, we don't not all of us have the privilege to travel, what more to travel around the world, but through literature, we are taken into different cities across continents, into different eras as well, even back to the time when we haven't existed yet. So that is one of the magic of that literature gives us. Okay. The next one is that literature makes us nicer. Um, have we all experienced this effect or this impact of reading? Why does literature make us nicer people? It has the extraordinary magic of letting us experience life from different people's perspectives. It allows us to consider what could be the consequences to our actions on others. It shows us examples of people who are good, who are very kind, who are generous, who are forgiving. Therefore, these books, these writers, they teach us to also be sympathetic to other people's ideas and feelings that are of very deep importance. So that's how literature makes us nicer. The next one is that literature is a cure for loneliness. We are very weird people. We are very weird creatures. We cannot really express or say exactly how we feel. Not all the time or not even sometimes. But in books, we find descriptions of who we really are and what events are actually like. In the best books, it's as if the writer knows us better than we know ourselves. They find the words to describe our fragile, our weird, our special experiences, like the simple or the casual light of a summer morning, um, like the anxiety we feel whenever we are at gatherings, the sensation of our first kiss. Could we ever describe that or put those into words? The longing we experience when we lose someone. Writers they have this capability to open our hearts and minds and give us a map to finding our own selves. It involves a certain type of honesty that is quite different from what an ordinary conversation allows. I hope that we have all experienced that kind of magic when we read books. An author once said that in the works of great writers, we find our own neglected feelings. Therefore, books are our true friends. They are always at hand. They are always available. They are never too busy. So that's why we should read. Okay, let's proceed to the last one. Hopefully, ma-convince ko na talaga kayo na magbasa na. Okay, I sound so awkward in Tagalog. Anyways, the last one is that literature prepares us for failure. Why so? Because a lot of literature is also about failure. It's about, thank you, Andy. It's about people who have messed up, right? Are you familiar with the person in the picture? Do you know what that story is about? It's from the play Hamlet. Anyways, all our lives, we have this constant fear of failing, fear of messing up, and fear of hurting others or disappointing others. But unlike other people or unlike the media, books aren't judgmental. Books aren't one-sided. So that is how literature prepares us for failure. It gives us a range of possibilities of also how we can cope with failure or with loneliness, with sadness. Yes, that's Ophelia. So that is all. That is quite a few good reasons to convince you guys to start reading now. Because overall, if literature is really doing all these things to us, then we should start to treat it more differently, diba? Like, it's not just something for the beach. It's not just something we bring to the car, to the airplane. It's not just something that we read to sleep, diba? Like, they say that books are very boring. It makes you sleep, or it lets you sleep. But it's far more than that. We should treat literature as therapy. Books are therapy. It's like how doctors treat medicine. It's something that we prescribe in response or as a cure to a range of ailments or problems. We can classify these books to what certain problems they work best for. Okay? So, am I talking too fast or okay ra? Okay lang ang pace ko.
You're good. You're great.
So that is how, okay, thank you. So that is how literature deserves, that is why literature deserves its prestige. Because it's a tool to help us live, to help us die with a little bit more wisdom, more knowledge, more goodness, and most of all, sanity. So that is the beauty of literature. Okay, let's proceed to our next topic. I hope that we can all squeeze in everything in an hour or so. The next topic will be very quick. It's just, this could be quite boring, but it would really help us understand why some people take their time to appreciate or understand literature. So these are the stages of literary appreciation. Is anyone familiar with this topic? Someone who already knows this topic? I hope I can add up more knowledge. So how do we define literary appreciation? It is the process of gaining pleasure and understanding for literature. When we appreciate a literary piece, we understand its value and its importance. We honor, we respect, or we admire the beauty and complexity of literature when we appreciate it. So these are the stages of literary appreciation. This is from a certain author, I forgot. But according to him, there are 7 stages of literary appreciation. The first one is experience from birth to kindergarten. So from 0 to 5 years old, we can already gain pleasure in literature. That is when we enjoy or that's when kids enjoy words from printed material. So this stage is more visual than auditory. So sample materials that kids read in this stage are nursery rhymes, folk tales, picture books, TV programs, and songs. In this stage, they start to read signs, perhaps in restaurants or in other places. They start to memorize their favorite stories and pretends to read. Have you encountered children who are like that? They memorize the book and they pretend to read like an expert reader. They enjoy singing and listening to stories. Okay, next, the next stage is experience in primary grades or from 6 to 8 years old. This is where one starts to learn to decode and develop an attention span. So they start to understand the words already. Whenever they read textbooks in schools, storybooks, easy to read books, science, and other real world messages. So in this stage, children take pride in reading in front of their parents or in front of others. They also enjoy reading alone and already has their favorite stories. The next stage, level 3, is experienced during late elementary years or 9 to 11 years old. This is where one starts to lose his or herself in literature. This is where we start to read series books, fantasies, animal stories, as well as comic books. In this stage, we read while doing chores or while traveling. We make friends with librarians because we often check out for new books or good books. And this is also where we get into reading a particular genre or author. So most common is fantasies or comic books. The next stage is experience during junior high school or 12 to 14 years old. This is where one starts to find himself or herself in literature. So this is where we read materials such as realistic fiction, where we can relate to the characters. We evaluate ourselves if we ever experience what these characters are experiencing. Also contemporary novels and wish-fulfilling stories. So in this stage, I for one have personally experienced this. I used to hide my novels inside the textbooks so I could read during classes. Like I read all the time. I couldn't sleep if I couldn't finish a book. So that's where I stay up at night just reading and crying in front of my book. So yeah, we can all feel this. So we also use reading as an escape from social pressures. So if you can look back to your high school years or elementary years, we always have that one classmate who is good with just sitting in the corner alone with a book. So that's where they find themselves in literature. Next stage is senior high school years, so from 15 to 18 years old. This is where we venture beyond self. So what does venturing mean? We explore more materials, more interesting materials. So tayo na lang ang makaka-define kung anong klaseng materials ang ini-explore natin noon. So this is where we read science fiction. This is very interesting. Good examples. High school sci-fi, or in my time, is Hunger Games, Divergent, even Twilight. They also read forbidden material. I don't know what exactly this forbidden material is, but I'm sure we can all relate if we have experienced this. We also venture into reading, quote unquote, different stories. So this is, in this stage, this is where we start to buy our own books. If we have our money, we have our own money. If wala, borrow lang muna. This is where I haven't included it in the list. This is where we start to lose our books because a lot of people borrow our books and never return it, and we never remember. In this stage is also where we get to get recommendations or suggestions from our friends, and we read beyond school assignments. Okay, the second to the last stage is from college to adulthood, 18 years old to adulthood. This is where we read widely. What do we mean by reading widely? I think when we are done with exploring more literary materials, this is where we read those literary works that are already acclaimed. So those bestsellers, what everyone is reading, what everyone is recommending, or what is being shown in the television, in the magazines, or in blogs. So that's where we read poems, plays, films, and magazines. In this stage, we talk about books and films with friends, especially those films that are adapted from a certain book or a certain novel. We sometimes join a book club and start to collect our own books. Okay, the last stage is experience during adulthood until we die. So this stage is referred to as aesthetic appreciation na, because it's like we are already done with all the materials that everyone's recommending. So this is where we start to think, why should I read the classics, or what am I missing out? What have I missed out? So this is where we read classics. I can totally relate. I think I'm already in this stage. When I became a teacher last year, I started to read a lot of classics. So I couldn't miss out on anything. So I would have something to say in this talk. Okay? This stage is where we read constantly. I can totally relate to this. Dreaming of writing the great American novel. Aren't we all, or don't we all want to be able to write the great American novel? This is where we enjoy literary and film criticism. When we watch films, we are often uncontented, or how do you call that? We're often not contented with what is shown in the film. We often Google for more meanings, more explanations, especially about the ending, about the themes in certain films. This is where we criticize more maturely or more in-depthly. Reads many books a year, depende kung may time, di ba? Sees plays, yeah, even musicals. We enjoy watching those. And we revisit our favorites. Okay, so that is the last stage of literary appreciation. Now, just a little something to take away from this topic. We should remember that people at any stage, they need to experience, or they need to enjoy that they are gaining something from reading or viewing or listening, which is why teachers or librarians or even parents should always meet younger people at where they are and make them more comfortable at that stage before trying to move them on. We can never force them, or else they wouldn't enjoy it. If we force them, some of them might grow discouraged or might join the millions of people who no longer read or who are no longer inspired to read. So that's why I'm very glad to do this talk, because I know that this is a whole new different platform or venue. My students are usually younger than me, but in this talk, I feel like I am the youngest. Okay, so that is all for the stages of literary appreciation. Now let's go to the last topic. This is my favorite topic of all. I really have to ask you whether you already know about this topic. Any thoughts or opinions about this topic? The approaches to literary criticism. Have you discussed this from your classes before? Okay, someone answered yes. I hope that I can still give you additional input regarding this topic. In my experience, my students really had a hard time in understanding this topic, but this is very, very interesting. Why is literary criticism important? How does it help us appreciate or understand a literary piece better? Because unlike our casual hobby of judging other people, literary criticism actually yields us or benefits us more, because while we are on the process of judging or criticizing, we also get to understand the literary piece better. So just a general definition, literary criticism is the study of evaluating or interpreting a certain type of literary piece. Like, should it be a poem, a short story, a novel, or other literary pieces? It's fundamentally the estimation of how valuable is a certain literary piece. So this involves a lot of standards, especially when you are a literary critic. But even if you aren't one, we can always learn more about a certain literary piece. Okay. So there are a lot of ways or a lot of approaches on how to analyze or understand a literary piece. These are just a few that I want to introduce to you. The first one is the post-colonialist literary criticism. From the term itself, post-colonialists are those literary works that are written by an author or that are about a certain country that was previously colonized by certain people, certain countries, or certain colonizers. So in this type of literary criticism, when we criticize a certain literary piece, it's like we are wearing a different pair of lenses. It focuses on something so that we wouldn't ruin the whole quality of understanding a literary piece. We wouldn't be confused with we wouldn't confuse ourselves with understanding every aspect of literature. You don't have to do that. You just have to focus on something in order to realize that this is a very good literary piece. So in this approach, we look at issues of power, economics, politics, religion, and culture, and how these elements work together in relation to colonial hegemony. So, colonial hegemony is defined as the influence or the impact of a colonizer to its colonized country. It's like the predominance of the colonizer among its colonized country. So the effects or influences of colonization. As I said, these are literature by people from formerly colonized country. So when we analyze a certain literary piece, perhaps a novel or a short story, we ask questions about the following. First, colonial oppression. Are there any subordinates or are there any people being oppressed in this story or in this poem? Are there any colonizer or are there any dominant people in this story or in this novel? Next one, we ask questions about personal and cultural identity. Personal versus cultural identity is when people tend to define themselves more differently because of how his or her culture or religion has influenced him or her. Also, questions about double consciousness and hybridity, if we are unfamiliar with this term. Double consciousness is when someone experiences an internal conflict of his own identity. Someone loses a sense of self because of outside forces or outside influences being imposed on that person. So this is usually experienced by oppressed people. Last one is questions about cultural differences. Are there any significant differences that these people experience before and after being colonized? So those are the guide questions lang in order to understand these stories better. Okay? So have you read examples of these types of literature? I guess rare lang because this is very, how do we call that? Primitive. Oh yeah, 100 Years of Solitude. That's a very good example. Also the short story Dead Man's Path by African Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe. Okay? Yes, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. That is an example of a post-colonialist literary criticism. Okay, thank you for participating. Let's proceed to the next one, which is the feminist literary criticism. This is very interesting because, as we all know, or as some of us know, when we go back to history, females aren't given any importance in the society before, right? So in this type of literary criticism, we look at a literary piece and analyze how this piece or how this story reinforces or undermines the economic, political, social, and psychological oppression of women. So this focuses on the topic or the subject of women, how aspects of our culture are inherently patriarchal. So to those who are unfamiliar with the term patriarchal, this refers to something that is male dominated or dominated by males. So as we go back to if we go back to history, females before don't have any significant role in the society. They're just kept at home. They aren't allowed to vote. They aren't even allowed to publish their own writings. Even in the Philippines, we have experience. We have that as part of our history. So in this type of literary criticism, we ask questions about the following. First, character representation. How are women characters represented in the story? Does it affect the story if the author's gender is male or female? Diba? Sometimes when the author is male, we tend to conclude that this is a very biased. This is a very gender biased writing. This is a very sexist book, or this is a very sexist article. So we question these aspects. The author's gender. Next, reader's gender is also considered in this criticism. We evaluate whether our gender affects how we perceive a certain literary piece, especially if it's about women, or especially if the author is women. Do they tend to empower women more in their writings? So when we are a male reader, do we consider or do we hate um, feminist books? Something like that. Also, questions about the text's relationship to power, sexuality, and gender. So how are these things interrelated, or how are these things represented in a certain literary text? Lastly, patriarchy and misogyny. Misogyny is referred to as the hatred for women. So some of us have read books that tend to be very misogynistic, especially if it's written from long time ago. Yeah, I've noticed that in some books that I have read. So that is how we analyze a literary piece using the feminist lens. Okay. One good example of a book or a novel that we can analyze using the feminist approach is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. So, have you read that book? Have you watched the film? So, yeah, Handmaid's Tale is a very good example. Handmaid's Tale is also one of my favorites. Okay, thank you for participating. Yeah, the bell jar. Sige. Let's proceed. Nancy Drew. Yeah, that's very interesting. Let's go to the next one. The next approach to literary criticism is the Marxist approach. Are you familiar with the term, or do you know about the theories of Karl Marx? Yes, okay. Karl Marx theorized about Marxism and capitalism. This is where class differences or the systems of the capitalists are explained. Okay? So in this type of literary criticism, in relation to literature, Marxist theories are applied in analyzing literary pieces by looking at issues regarding class differences, social classes, social status, economics, and the implications and complications of the capitalist system. This type of approach attempts to reveal the ways in which our socioeconomic system or our socioeconomic standing or status is the ultimate source of our experience. I guess we can all relate to this because I think we all agree that or we all agree that our social status will always affect how other people perceive us, how other people will treat us. So if you're rich, if you're poor, if you belong to the upper class, in the lower class, or in the middle class, it always is an issue as to how we establish our relationship with others. So if we have read a few literary pieces that are about, or that focuses on social status, then this is a very good approach in trying to understand that certain literary piece. So we ask questions about social class. What is the story about? Who are the characters? In which social class do the characters belong? Is the main character rich? Is the main character poor? And all that. Also, questions about conflict of values. We can all agree that people who belong from different social classes different um, always have conflicting values, because we are born and raised in different ways, more than the same. Okay, so the next question we ask is about the interaction between characters. How do the characters who belong to different social classes interact with each other? How do the rich treat the poor, and vice versa? So that is simply how the Marxist literary criticism works. Have you read the short story about the necklace? It's written by Guy de Maupassant. It's a very good example of a Marxist literature. Okay, thank you. Some of you has already read The Necklace. It's about um, a woman who tried to fit in to the society of rich people. She borrowed a diamond necklace, and she lost the necklace, and then she worked her whole life just to pay for that necklace. And when she returned that necklace, she realized that it was only a fake diamond necklace. So yeah, you should read that story. Okay? Sige, thank you for participating. Let's go to the next um, approach. Charm, how many minutes do we have left? I haven't really took track of the time.
No, you're good. Just go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Sige, the next one is a very, very interesting approach to literary criticism. That is the psychoanalytic approach. Ang name itself pa lang, di ba? This literary criticism is based on Sigmund Freud's theories of psychoanalogy, or how do you call that? Psychology. Okay. Are you familiar with Mr. Sigmund Freud and his theories of psychology? Those who did not listen to their psychology teachers, I will take over. So, in order for us to better understand this literary approach, we have to understand first the theories of psychology by Sigmund Freud. We have the id, ego, superego, and the Oedipus complex. Are we all familiar with this? If we are, I'm still gonna explain. Okay? So the theory of the id, ego, and superego is like a battle between the three parts of our consciousness, or our brain, not physical parts, huh? These are like three elements in our brain battling for dominance. Like, what am I gonna follow? My id, my ego, my superego. So just a simple explanation. The id represents a person's desires, usually our sexual desires, our libido, our inner anxieties, our inner thoughts, our desires, what we want to do. Next, the superego, in contrast to the id, it represents our morality, like what is the right thing to do, what should we do. The ego is like the mediator of the id and superego. It represents our reality, who we really are. So that is the concept of the id, ego, and superego. How about the Oedipus complex? Have we all been introduced to this theory? It's also a very interesting one. The Oedipus complex is based on the story of Oedipus Rex. Have we read this story? Do you all know the story of Oedipus Rex? Because I'm still gonna narrate it. Okay, so Oedipus Rex is a guy who was born into a king and a queen, Queen Jocasta and King Laius. So this king and queen received a prophecy that one day they are going to bear a child, and this child is going to kill his own father and marry his own mother. So in short, they were afraid to fulfill the prophecy, so they left Oedipus in the woods. They abandoned him in the woods, and when he grew up, he eventually encountered King Laius, which he did not know at that time that it was his father. And he happened to have a conflict with King Laius, and he killed King Laius. And fast forward, he encountered his mother, Jocasta, which he did not know at that time also that was his mother. They fell in love, and then they married each other. And when they realized, or they married each other. So in short, the prophecy was fulfilled. And when Queen Jocasta realized that the prophecy was fulfilled, she hung herself in the end out of shame. And I don't know. I remember being scolded by my English teacher because I didn't read it. Okay, now you should read it because it's a very good story. Okay, so that is the basis of the theory of Oedipus complex. So in relation to Sigmund Freud's theory of psychology, the Oedipus complex is a theory wherein a child develops an unconscious infatuation toward his or her opposite sex parent. For example, you are a male child, you tend to develop a likeness, or you tend to develop an infatuation towards your mother. But that's totally normal or unexplainable yet kay theory pa man. But this is what Sigmund Freud used to explain why some children always prefer the attention of their opposite sex parent, and they always fight for their attention with their same sex parent. So if you're a girl, you always want your dad's attention, and you get mad at your mom sometimes for I don't know, you get mad at your mom if your dad's attention is divided between the two of you, and vice versa. So that is how Oedipus complex. Yeah, it's Electra complex for the women. Thank you, Jules. Um, yeah, so in this type of literary criticism, we look at the characters' behavior. How do the characters' mind work, or also the author? What is the mental state of the author? Does it affect his writing? Because in one of my sources, it is said that literary texts are like dreams. They express the secret unconscious desires and anxieties of the author. So that is why we have to dig in deeper in order to understand, and to understand better why this certain text is written like this. We also have to check on the author's background. For example, Vincent van Gogh, although not literature related, Vincent van Gogh is a painter who cut his own ear. He is a very depressed artist, which who painted very beautiful pieces. So in that sense, we can gain that a an author's mind always affects how he writes his works. So in this type of criticism, we ask questions about repression. Repression refers to the when we repress something, it's like we throw away our thoughts. It's like we exclude our unwanted thoughts from our consciousness. When we repress something, we don't want to remember bad memories or people who gave us heartaches, something like that. So that is repression. Are there any repressive episodes displayed by the characters? So that is how we analyze a certain text. Next, Oedipal dynamics. Are there any issues of incest going on in the literary piece? So Oedipus Rex is one example. Next, the character's behavior. How does the character act, or how does the character treat the other characters? Next, operations of the id, ego, and superego. Next, as I said, the author's psychological being. We always have to check the background of this author. So that is considered in this literary criticism. Next, the psychological motives of the reader. We should also assess ourselves. Do we all notice that we tend to relate more to a literary piece when we are sad, or when we are feeling lonely, or feeling angry, or even when we are happy? It affects our interpretation of, or our perception of, a certain text. It depends on our own mental state as well. Next, are there any hidden meanings in some words, some recurring words that the author has written, or we call them problem words? What could these words mean, or what could the author be sending us, or what message could the author be sending us? Okay, so there are a lot of examples of textbooks that, or novels, stories, or poems that we can analyze using this literary criticism. What examples can we give? The Catcher in the Rye, Catcher in the Rye, is one great classic by J.D. Salinger. Yes. Okay. What else? The short story, The Cask of Amontillado, like Edgar Allan Poe's works, can be analyzed using the psychoanalytic approach. Okay, thank you for participating. Sige, let's go to the next one. I think this is the third to the last topic. This is one of my favorite literary, one of my favorite approaches to literary criticism. The postmodernist literary criticism is where, yes, Lolita, is where the ways and places, is where systems, frameworks, definitions, and certainties break down. Why do they break down? Because these types of literary works are not like your ordinary storylines. It displays far more than that. It displays very weird, very dark, but fulfilling or nice concepts. So postmodernist literatures are texts that are seen as a reaction against Enlightenment thinking or modernist approach. So Enlightenment or modernist. In contrast to postmodernists, modernist literary criticisms are, or modernist literature are based on reason or rational thinking or logic, while postmodernist literature is based on feelings and emotions, or what the author actually wants to write, or what the author wants to explore. So in short, the modernist belief is very objective, while the postmodernist belief is very subjective. That is why the author has a very huge freedom in exploring different concepts. So these types of literature are characterized by heavy reliance on the following techniques. First is fragmentation. To explain fragmentation, it's like the author is dividing certain parts of the story or the novel, or it's like the author is separating or rearranging these details in order to give the reader a more impactful experience. It's really hard to explain, but when you get to read these types of literature, you would understand how these techniques work. Also, questionable narrators. This is very evident in Edgar Allan Poe's works. He is very famous for his, like the Kafka on the Shore. Edgar Allan Poe is very known for his works with questionable narrators. Of course, when the story is narrated by in a first-person point of view, we can never rely on just a one-sided perspective. So this is what makes a certain literary piece more interesting. It adds up to a more interesting effect or reading experience to the readers. Next is intertextuality. Intertextuality is the relationship of one text to another. So in this type of literature, we can notice that the author is trying to get concepts or trying to refer some parts of his text to other texts. Again, it's hard to explain, but you can understand this when we get to read an example. One example of this type of literature is Lolita. Have we all read this novel? This is a very interesting novel. So if we read Lolita, we get to experience all of these in one book. So it tackles concepts about pedophilia, about murder, about besides, it's a very disturbing novel. If you can even watch the film, but it's a whole new different experience when we read the book. Okay, so in this oh wait, I forgot to mention this type of literary criticism also relies on the black humor technique. Do you know what black humor is? It sounds very sexist, but it's not comedy from black people. Black humor is it's like a technique used by writers to display a certain type of aggressive or weird type of comedy. It to the extent that it becomes nihilistic. Nihilistic refers to the belief that everything is worthless or there's no point in being kind, so everything should be destroyed. So that's nihilistic. One good example that we may all be familiar with, although it's not a book, the latest film about Joker. That is a very good example of black humor. So we can understand black humor in the concepts of that film. Okay? Yes, Black Mirror. So Black Mirror is also very, I don't know, advanced. It's very advanced. It's very futuristic at the same time. Yes, Parasite. Yes, Parasite. Kay daghan it has so many concepts that we cannot explain right away. We have to really think about after watching the film. So in this, when we analyze a certain literary piece using this approach, we ask questions about the following. Yeah, first, language. What type of language is used by the author, and how does it affect the overall impact or the overall reading experience? Next, generally accepted truth. As I said, this type of literature often breaks down or often goes beyond what is normal, what is ordinary, what is moral. So we evaluate if the values displayed or represented in this work belongs to the general accepted truth or more than that, or does it violate conventions. Next, memory or identity reconstruction. Yes, as I said, this type of literature very weird to the point of being really disturbing, at the same time interesting and satisfying. I like those types of literature. Next, writer. I'm sorry, that's writer. Writer, work, and reader separation. So we evaluate how do these three elements differ from the text itself. In the postmodernist period, this is also where authors like homosexual authors gain their fame. This is where they excelled. Okay, diba? Before, we often, even now, some people also consider the concept of homosexuality a very immoral value. So this is where we explore those types of ideologies. Next, ideologies. So what type of ideologies? Yes, Oscar Wilde. Did you all know about that? What type of ideologies are being promoted or are being undermined in this type of literature? So there's a very huge range of ideologies that we can tackle in postmodernist literature, like pedophilia, homosexuality, um, some immoral topics are being tackled in this type of literature. So if you are interested about that, you should read a few examples of this type of literary criticism. Next, points of view. So in this type of literature, the writer can also explore in having multiple points of view, like writing the story in different people's perspectives. So that also creates an added effect to the whole reading experience. So that's what makes this type of literary criticism really, really interesting. Okay, let's go to the second to the last one. Wait, sorry. What happened? Okay. The second to the last one is the deconstructionist literary criticism. How do we define the word or the term deconstruction? This is where we take apart or where we break down a certain text in order to decipher a new meaning. So this is where we reject traditional readings. Instead, we try to seek or we try to find contradictory viewpoints and analysis. We analyze something by going beyond what is being given by the author. So if this is how you understand the book, or if this is how the author wants us to understand his writing or his poem, this is usually applied in poetry, because the words in poetry are very unstable. They could have a lot of meanings. So this is very this approach is very good in analyzing poems. It is said that a story may disguise rather than revealing the underlying perplexities of the author. So as I said, in order to really understand what the underlying meanings are, we have to take apart, or we have to break down every part of the text so that we don't miss out anything. We give infinite possible meanings or interpretations about a certain text. So in analyzing a text using the deconstructionist approach, we ask questions about various conflicting interpretations produced by the text. Next, the instability of language and the undecidability of meanings. As I said, a certain word could have a million meanings, possible meanings. So in the deconstructionist approach, we try to go over each meaning in order to understand the literature better. Lastly, ideology is presented in the text and where it is limited. So we analyze the ideologies and what could be the purpose of the author in representing these types of concepts. So have you read any interesting poems that we can deconstruct? Is any of you interested in reading poetry? Because most people or some people easily gives up in poetry. Wow, I got a poem. Marvin Fort, Ozymandias. Yeah, even our own Filipino writers, they write really, really good poems. Our national artists, you should also check them out. Do you know Edith Tiempo? Have you read her poem Lament for the Littlest Fellow and Bonsai? You should check her out. Yes, Bonsai. So someone knows that poem. Okay? So thank you. Let's go to the last one. Let's go to the last approach, literary criticism. This is what we call the formalist approach. So from the word formalist, what is the root word? What's the root word of the word formalist? List. Okay. Casual, formal. Okay, form. Someone answered it. From the word formalist, we get the root word form. So this type of literary criticism focuses on the form or the structure of a certain literary text. Therefore, outside um, outside the elements or aspects such as biographical, historical, and intellectual contexts are excluded from this type of criticism because the keys to understanding these texts exist within the text itself. Therefore, we focus on its form, the organization, the structure, the word choice, language, and devices. Therefore, this technique is very technical. It's a very technical way to criticize a literary piece, but it is also a way to appreciate a literary piece better. So we ask questions about literary elements and devices. What literary elements and devices did the author use in order to create a special effect for the readers? So are we familiar with the literary elements and devices? We have imagery, symbolism, archetype. There are so many devices that one can use in order to make a more interesting writing. Next, imagery and symbols. Words and syntax. How are the words formed or organized or arranged in a way that it creates a more impactful or meaningful piece? Next, rhyme schemes. This applies to poems or poetry. And the overall content. So we can analyze any type of text generally using this type of literary criticism. For example, the novel The Great Gatsby. We can use the formalist approach in analyzing that film or that book, that novel. Okay. So I guess I've already said a lot. It's time for you na naman to ask questions from me. Hopefully I can answer them because I'm really expecting this talk to be a more casual one. So don't expect me to um, answer difficult questions. Okay, so that is the last slide. I think this isn't the latest I edited because I put like a thank you note or a question and answer portion slide, but this is the end of my presentation.